Hare Krishna, and welcome to the BLISS Podcast. I'm still trying to figure out a smoother way how to make this intro, as opposed to switching between my, as you just saw, switching between my OBS and then the previous podcast where we have the sound file with the original BLISS Podcast intro music and then the graphic that I use for each new podcast. It's not exactly very smooth, but we're going to figure something out more technical. Maybe someone who has some more technical expertise can help me out, make this more professional. So today we're going to be talking about counterculture. And before I start this podcast, I got to give a big kudos, big shout out to my dear Prabhu Bhakti Neil, who's representing Krishna in Australia. Down under the world, right? If the world is a globe, Bhakti would be upside down. Anyway, that's a topic for another podcast. We're not going to get into that here. So, Bhakti suggested we did counterculture. And to be honest with you, to be quite frank with you, I heard this term used a lot, and it does actually play a very significant role in the Krishna Consciousness movement. But I actually really didn't know very much about the history of counterculture and really actually what the term means by dictionary definition. So I've done some research and I've had some realizations from a Krishna conscious point of view. So if you will embark with me on this journey through the counterculture, let us begin. So it's a kind of a packed stuff. There's lots of stuff to unpack. I'm going to try and condense it down. Let us, okay, hold on. Now, let's go for a dictionary definition of what actually is counterculture, just so we're all familiar and we have a bit of a basis to work off of here for this podcast. Now, I don't know exactly, what this website is, if it's reliable or whatever. Oh, okay, here it's from a wiki entry. All right, so I also don't know if that's reliable, but they seem to give some kind of substantive definition here. A subculture, right, is kind of defining something with another thing you might not know, so that's not very helpful. But anyway, a subculture whose values and norms of behavior differ substantially from those of mainstream society, often in opposition to mainstream cultural mores. A countercultural movement expresses the ethos and aspirations of a specific population during a well-defined era. When oppositional forces reach critical mass, countercultures can trigger dramatic cultural changes. Okay, so I think one of the most important things here is often in opposition to mainstream cultural mores, and it expresses the ethos and aspirations of a specific population during a well-defined era. Now, the counterculture that most people are familiar with when you speak of counterculture is that of the famous hippie movement in the United States of America, which reached its peak in the Haight-Ashbury of San Francisco, the city of San Francisco, wherein literally hundreds of thousands of hippies gathered together to try and start an alternative way of life, which was completely counter, in every aspect, practically speaking, to the status quo, the current way that people were living. Now, it's very interesting. The backdrop of this countercultural movement is the 1950s boom after the war. So now this documentary has a nice clip here which explains very nicely from some personal accounts and some nice footage why the hippie movement really, what was the kind of impetus for it to begin in the first place from a historical point of view. So let's just watch this clip and we'll maybe get some enlightenment.
The first hippies were children of the 1950s, the baby boom generation. Their parents had endured years of economic depression and a brutal world war. Now the future looked bright. Millions of Americans started families, encouraged by the unprecedented prosperity of the post-war economic boom.
We came out of World War II as the richest, most powerful country on the planet. And our families built the suburbs. And the fathers went off to work, and the mothers stayed home. And the kids were basically left to run around.
The new standard of living in 1950s America offered an abundance of affordable homes, sleek new automobiles, miracle drugs. Science and technology seemed to have an answer for everything. But beneath the surface lurked a deep anxiety. Peacetime had devolved into a bitter Cold War between superpowers. Americans linked to communist groups were hounded and persecuted.
Are you a member of the Communist Party, or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Are you now? Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
An atomic arms race fueled fears of annihilation.
That combination of affluence and anxiety is a crazy-making combination to live with, to grow up with. So you had a generation of kids who arrived at high school and then in college trying to make sense of a world which they've been told is just grand and wonderful and there's nothing to complain about anymore. And on the other hand, you look a little deeper into it and it's just awful and scary. There was a deep issue here. Whether material affluence is what life is all about. Because that is what an industrial society, a market economy can give you. But what if that's not good enough?
Okay, so yes, that's very nice point has been made there. And we a little covered this on the previous podcast, and it's a recurring theme, of course, in all these podcasts almost. I wouldn't say all these podcasts, but a good many. That material enjoyment, unlike spiritual enjoyment, has a saturation point, a limitation, and it's not that by increasing that you can become satisfied, because material enjoyment pertains to the material body, the material senses, of which we are not. We are spirit soul. We are that aspect of an entity, a unit of being that is making the body alive. We're the consciousness, not the body. We're not the senses, not the mind, any of these things. So, material enjoyments, like they mentioned here, right? Nice automobiles, immunity from disease, medical treatments, economic well-being, nice homes, affordable homes. All of these things pertain to a comfortable situation for the body, right? Maybe even a little satisfaction of the mind. But ultimately, that is not what satisfies the soul. So, no matter how much you increase this material enjoyment, you'll never be satisfied. And this countercultural movement is a very interesting example of this, practically shown on a wide scale, which actually our spiritual master, Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, capitalized on. You could say capitalized. He made a big point in his preaching about this saturation with material life, because also many of the hippies who became tired of this materialistic way of life and took to an alternative lifestyle, they took up to the process of Krishna Consciousness. And our Srila Prabhupada actually came to the Haight-Ashbury. We're going to get into that a little bit later in the podcast. And he was preaching to these hippies. And Prabhupada often made it a point that if material enjoyment is the topmost perfection, then why have so many young boys and girls who are in the prime portion of their life for material enjoyment, why do they give it up and now they become simply chanting Hare Krishna, living very simple lives, basically as mendicants? And I thought I'd bring up this quote here. We covered this conversation in the previous podcast on communism, but I think this quote is even more strikingly appropriate here. So let's just take a little read of what Srila Prabhupada says. Now, if we go back in time, Shyamasundar asked Prabhupada, their goal, now we're talking about the communists here, the goal is the production of material goods for the enhancement of human well-being. And Srila Prabhupada says, that is useless. Economic production in America has no comparison in the world, yet people are still dissatisfied. The young men are confused. It is nonsensical to think that simply by increasing production, everyone will become satisfied. No one will be satisfied. Man is not meant simply for eating. He has mental necessities, intellectual necessities, spiritual necessities. In India, many people sit alone silently in the jungle and practice yoga. They do not require anything. How will increased production satisfy them? If someone were to say to them, if you give up this yoga practice, I will give you 200 bags of rice. They would laugh at the proposal. It is animalistic to think that simply by increasing production, everyone will become satisfied. Real happiness does not depend on either production or starvation, but upon peace of mind. For example, if a child is crying, but the mother does not know why, the child will not stop simply by giving him some milk. Sometimes this actually happens. The mother cannot understand why her child is crying, and though she is giving him her breast, he continues to cry. Similarly, dissatisfaction in human society is not caused solely by low economic production. That is nonsense. There are many causes of dissatisfaction. The practical example is America, where there is sufficient production of everything, yet the young men are becoming hippies. They are dissatisfied, confused. No, simply by increasing economic production, people will not become satisfied. Marx's knowledge is insufficient. Perhaps because he came from a country where people were starving, he had that idea. Okay, so this is very interesting. Prabhupada is very expertly also preaching to this generation of this gap generation of young men and young girls who were feeling dissatisfied, especially spiritually, in that society at the time, post-50s society, which was incredibly affluent, incredibly successful. And the older generation, they were apparently satisfied, right? But these young people who were a little bit more awake, had a little bit more ideals, were not so stuck in their ways, realized that they're not satisfied simply with being in the rat race, simply going after eating and sleeping and mating and defending. There must be something a little bit higher. And as the previous documentary pointed out something very interesting, that illusion was smashed by this prospect of a potential nuclear war, that the whole world might be destroyed, that not everything is perfect, and that even if you build up everything very nicely on the material side of things, it will ultimately all be destroyed. And that nuclear destruction is just kind of an early wake-up call to the ultimate issue, which is death. You know, what are we all going to do? What is actually life about? It awoke that atato brahma jignas, which is the inquiry that every human being should come to. Everyone should come to the point of inquiry while they're in the human form of life, while they have the opportunity, the brain facility, right? An animal, he can't think to himself, why am I in this body? What is the purpose of my life? This is only for human beings. So this inquisitiveness was awoken in the hippies, and it obviously manifested in different ways, and it manifested in the in some principal portions. Some principal ways. Young people wanted to explore sexually. Unfortunately, there was a sexual revolution. There was also a psychedelic revolution. Young people were exploring psychedelic substances to expand the consciousness And also they had political motivations. They were dissatisfied with the wars, with the Cold War tension, and then also eventually the Vietnam War. So they had some political aims, and and a general dissatisfaction with the materialistic way of life, and an inclination towards communal living, kind of a peaceful society where you're living off the land, living simply, and expanding consciousness. And this is quite nicely expressed by the Grateful Dead singer Jerry Garcia in this documentary. So I'll just play this quick clip.
What we're thinking about is a peaceful planet. We're not thinking about anything else. We're not thinking about any kind of power. We're not thinking about any of those kind of struggles. We're not thinking about revolution or war or any of that. We would all like to be able to live an uncluttered life, a simple life, a good life, and think about moving the whole human race ahead a step.
And one of the ways of achieving that being is through drugs.
I think, personally, that the more people turn on, the better world is going to be.
Yeah, so this is the idea, that they were frustrated with the kind of ends that everyone was at in the world. And, of course, if anyone thinks of hippies, generally they think of the V sign, and which is the symbol of peace, right? Peace and love, this idea that love is the answer to all questions. Actually, we were on the street in London here, in Oxford Street, which is one of the busiest streets in London, which is heavily saturated with materialism, but that's another thing. And we met some lady who came to us, and while we were having a conversation with another man about some various issues, and she came in, and her philosophy, which she was basically the only little philosophy she had, she didn't elaborate very much on it, but that God is love, and simply love each other, and then everything will be okay. So this is kind of a remnant of the hippie era, that everyone should simply love each other, and there should be voluntary service. We should serve each other, and everyone should be equally respected. The communistic idea is coming in also there. So it is a good ideal, of course, that everyone should be loved and everyone should be treated in a fair way. Of course, there are some differing views on feminism and things like this, but that's that topic for another podcast. But this idea was wrongly guided by people like Timothy Leary, and I think there are many clips here of Timothy Leary, most likely. Here we go. Here's one.
There's a sense of being in communion with powers greater than yourself, and intelligence which far outstrips the human mind, and energies which are very ancient. You have a sense of being brought into God's workshop, and or that the veil is pulled away, and for the first time you see how things really are.
Hey.
So I don't want to promote drugs or anything here, but Timothy Leary was a Harvard professor who started experimenting. He was a psychology professor, and he started experimenting with the lysergic, what is that, something, diltryptamine, LSD substance, which is not exactly a consciousness-expanding drug. In one sense it is, but one thing it does, and we discussed this on our Drugs Spiritual podcast, you can go check that out. I'll put a link in the description below. It does at least awaken you to some idea that there is something greater. It's certainly not spiritual, a little spoiler for the podcast, but yeah. So Timothy Leary was in earnest misguiding people into thinking that the solution of everything would be the use of LSD on a widespread scale, and that everyone would be able to reach some kind of enlightenment, or the highest enlightenment, through the use of drugs. And of course, this wasn't very long-lasting, just like the high itself. and even though people took to these drugs on a huge scale, eventually the hippie movement died off. So the solution was clearly not found in the use of psychedelic substances, but this was one of the bases for the counterculture movement. And it's generally this idea, and also there was a big shift towards Eastern religions, Eastern spirituality, because people were looking for that alternative way of thinking, like Jerry Garcia said. People were, and still are to this day, to some extent, looking for some higher principle. So there was this big sway at the time towards even chanting and expansion of consciousness, trying to reach the divine, as they would have said it, trying to reach some kind of God realization. So it was a prime time for the Hare Krishna movement to take off. And I don't think I'm going to be able to find it here, but there are some clips of... This is not a Krishna Conscious documentary, but there are clips of people chanting Hare Krishna here in the streets of Haight-Ashbury. Because, this is a kind of like a... How do you say? Ripe. This is a ripe setting for the Krishna Consciousness movement to take hold. Because, as we discussed on our previous podcast, which you can go check out on this channel, there are some good ideals in the communal idea of living, the hippie ideals, even the communist philosophy, which find their real home, real solution in the philosophy of Krishna Consciousness. And so that's why many young people resonated with the Krishna Consciousness movement at that time, and it took off in such a wild way in San Francisco in the Haight-Ashbury. It was a very ripe time for that kind of thing. So anyway, getting more into what actually is counterculture and like that, one realization in this connection is that counterculture is basically a pocket of conditioned souls that have become saturated with the material world and are trying to penetrate the coverings of gross material enjoyment and create a spiritual atmosphere. And they're basically desperately struggling with the material means, with the limited mind, without a higher authority and proper guidance, to create an atmosphere of peace and love and all these nice ideals. But without that proper philosophy, without Krishna being in the center, it is not possible. Right? This is actually the perfection of this peace and love philosophy, which counterculture has as one of its foremost ideas. And here's a nice picture to illustrate what actually how this perfection can be reached. Counterculture finds frustration with conflict, and it has that trace of communistic idea that competition is not good, classism is not good, that people should lord it over other people, and there should be an unfair benefits. Some people should suffer at other people's expense, which is a nice ideal. Of course, also a little misguided, but it finds its perfection in the Krishna conscious philosophy, because why this happens. Now, if you take this example, this nice picture of this drop of water, I think there maybe was some heavier object, more dense object dropped into this pond, and the bubble of water has flown up here. You can see there's one center, and then there are many rings around that center. So, in the materialistic way of life, because everything is based on self-interest, now you can just imagine there's a circle here, a stone dropped here, and a stone dropped here, and a stone dropped here. Now, from experience, you can understand that this stone that was dropped here would have its own ripple effect, and this stone would also have its own ripple effect. And all these ripple effects, they would clash with one another, right? So, but when there's one center, then all these ripples, there are many, many ripples in this picture, but you can see they never conflict. They outstretch into a wide radius, but the ripples never overlap each other. So similarly, if the center of our lives and our aim of work and relationship is one, then everything is perfect. Nothing overlaps. Nothing is in a conflict. So how is this possible? Who can be that one person? Who can be that one center? Right? The only worthy person is Krishna or God. The perfect person, the supreme person. If Krishna is in the center of all of our activities, if we devote our lives to Krishna, instead of devoting our own lives to our own materialistic, selfish pursuits, then this idea of perfect, you could say practically utopian community can, not utopian in the sense that it will never work, but this perfect community can work. And it did work for millions of years. The Vedic culture was based on this idea that no matter how many people there are, you work in your particular Varna. We covered this in the previous podcast. You can go there for a bit more of an in-depth explanation. You work in your particular area of special expertise, whether it be the intelligent class or the worker class or the mercantile class or the administrative class of people. You work in your particular area of expertise and you dedicate your work to Krishna. And in this way, there are no conflicts because everything is in around one center, and that is the satisfaction of the Lord. So this is how this communal living can happen nicely. What's more is that everyone is satisfied in that relationship. There's no dissatisfaction. And because everyone is satisfied in that internal engagement, it's also everlasting. One thing that you can see with the counterculture movements is eventually they die off because people have not purified that consciousness. They haven't undergone any spiritual process of purification. So although it is a nice ideal that we all should live in harmony and peace and love and all these things, ultimately, because everyone still has those selfish interests because of material conditioning, everything crumbles and fails, and nothing has ever been successful in this way. That's why capitalism is the most successful economic system, because everyone in the material world is working for his own benefits, and it's basically an envious society where people are trying to top other people, lord it over, be the most successful. It's a competition-based society. Capitalism always prevails, while there is communism, which may have some good ideals, can't work because it requires a process of controlling the senses, controlling the mind, and purification of the heart. Here's an example of a commune in New Zealand that was very idealistic, working very nicely for some time, but then it became, practically speaking, completely destroyed, deserted, and I have to say a little sad. Let's take a look. So I don't have to go full screen here.
Mahana started, it was a festival in the 1970s, in Nambassa Festival. People put forward that all problems in the world are caused by the ownership of land. So the Mahana people that were there, that took part in that festival, got enthused by that, and they decided to form a company to buy a block of land and set the land free, so that it was not owned by anybody, and anybody could come and live here. They took out a mortgage, and the mortgage was eventually paid off, and the land is now what they call freehold, an open community. Any person can be a member by signing the book, agree to these rules. You don't have to pay a fee. Yeah, there are hundreds of members of the Mahana society. They don't necessarily live here, but they agree with the rules and the object of the society. Of course, over the years, that philosophy has sort of been watered down by the ones who presently live here. The rot started about 12 years ago. People started drifting away, and the ones that stayed here, they want to change the rules and have the land only for themselves again, which again, as you can see, that creates the problem. They want to own it, it's theirs, and you can't come here.
Yeah, so very nice example. He previously mentioned in this documentary also that there were around 80 adults living here and 27 children, so quite a thriving community. But yeah, eventually people... I also noticed a very common theme in all of these hippie accounts when people are remembering what happened. Basically, why it all died off, one of the reasons is that people grew up and they became attracted by the pleasures of the material world once again. Because again, there was no higher taste, there was no purification of consciousness, no spiritual pleasure actually. The drugs they can't satisfy. And so eventually people became disinterested with this ideal that couldn't really find satisfaction and perfection. And the idea became neglected. And now you see communities like this that may have once been working very nicely are just left abandoned. And people become overwhelmed once again by the greed and by the lording it over propensity that all the conditioned souls have. So although it's a nice ideal, and although it's a good thing that people rebel against the rat race of society, it needs to be properly guided. Just like Srila Prabhupada came and guided the Westerners or many of the Westerners who were involved with the hippie movement. He guided them in the proper direction, gave them the philosophy of Krishna Consciousness, the process, and in that way many people, many young devotees, they became purified and spread this movement, and it's had tremendous effect. So now, okay, so, and there's many other things really to cover, but running on a little bit of time. So yeah, I'm just trying to think of what best to show next. Let's see this one. Let's just jump into a random clip. Let's see what happens.
For me, the cutting edge was, I thought that the world had changed, that everything which had perhaps given meaning to life in the past, all the traditions, whether it was religion, manners, dress, marriage, family, everything, all of that had collapsed.
My father seems to have already settled down, settled into his ways, knows what's right, knows what's wrong.
Okay, so this is like another theme of the hippie movement. Why the hippies? Because they were fed up with the old way of living, and they wanted something new, which also seems idealistic, of course. But the thing is that, as I realized, from one point of view, you can say it's like, okay, people are awakening to a spiritual perspective. But from another angle, it is also another excuse simply to enjoy in different ways. That's why you see things like the sexual revolution, the abuse of psychedelic drugs. And I was watching a documentary about the Haight-Ashbury when hundreds of thousands of hippies came over into the neighborhood of Haight-Ashbury in the summer of love, 1968, I can't remember exactly. When that happened, it was actually originally a kind of a small group of hippies who were more devoted to the ideals of the original movement, right? Communal living, alternative lifestyle, free love, whatever. And actually the vast, vast majority of people simply came to enjoy the open-air sexual life and abuse of psychedelic drugs. It was mostly people looking for an excuse to enjoy sense gratification. So although it may have its roots in some kind of higher principles, generally it's taken advantage of. What's worse is that this movement, unless it has proper guidance, it can take very drastic turns in the wrong direction. And, you might think that the hippies very nice, but let's just take a look at when it doesn't go exactly according to plan.
The great Supreme Commander, Chairman Mao, issued a world-shaking call to us. You should pay attention to state affairs and carry the great proletarian cultural revolution through to the end. With the Red Guards, revolutionary young people as pathbreakers, the workers, peasants and soldiers are marching forward courageously. The red torrents of the great proletarian cultural revolution are sweeping the country and shaking the whole world. Chairman Mao says, Marxism consists of thousands of truths, but they all boil down to one phrase: it's right to rebel. The proletarian revolutionary rebels hold high the great red banner of Mao Zedong's thought. Through big character posters and great debates, they argue things out, expose, criticize, and repudiate thoroughly, and launch fierce attacks on all kinds of representatives of the bourgeoisie, sweeping away all such monsters. The heroic young Red Guard fighters go out on the streets. That is, the old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits left over by the old society which spread feudal poison and symbolized imperialist aggression and capitalist exploitation. They are destroying old shop signs and replacing them with revolutionary ones. The scum and dregs, such as street names insulting the Chinese people left by imperialism and revisionism, must be completely destroyed. Let Mao Zedong's thought occupy all positions. They are putting up quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong. The Chinese people will go all out to establish the new ideas, new culture, new customs, and new habits of the proletariat. The great proletarian cultural revolution has pushed the mass movement of creative study and application of Chairman Mao's works to a new stage. In our great motherland, a new era is emerging, in which workers, peasants and soldiers are grasping Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong's thought. The great proletarian cultural revolution has promoted the revolutionization of people's thinking.
Also, just like to point out very quickly, just see how this guy has...
The cultural revolution are sweeping the country courageously.
The second guitar movement has such...
The workers, peasants and soldiers are marching forward courageously. The red torrents...
Nice pair of Jayapatakas. Anyway, so, although this is actually not really to be joked about at all, this seems a very inspiring mood, right? It's actually very similar, if you take a look and hear carefully. It's a very similar mood to the counterculture movement of the 1960s in the US. Actually, it happened at exactly the same time. The previous way of life is outdated and it's not working. So let us try something new. Let's create a revolution and let's go for an alternative lifestyle. In America, it just so happened that LSD was there, and there was... No, actually, pretty much everything was the same. There was also, in China, there was also previously had been some conflicts, and people were feeling dissatisfied with the capitalistic way of life. So, very, very thin line between these two movements. In America, it was almost non-violent. Of course, there were some violent protests like the one we can see here.
The protesters challenged the police clubbed the protesters.
Protesters, journalists, local residents, and even members of the clergy are beaten by police.
Yeah, so, I mean, of course, there was some violence during the hippie movement, but comparatively to this China's Cultural Revolution, which was insinuated by Mao Zedong, it's nothing. And it's very disturbing, actually, what happened there. And it, again, strikingly similar. One of the main atrocities that was perpetrated by Mao Zedong was the institution of the Red Guards, which were young students who were fed up with the old ways of life, dissatisfied, and while in America, young people became more independent and free, and they tried to get free from government influence. So that was more cultivated into into communal living, independent living, whatever. In China, the government took a hold of this energy, unbridled energy, and guided it in a direction which was extremely violent. So I just show a couple clips here, some memories. This doesn't actually show
of all kinds of hair, they were seen as examples of bourgeois decadence. We said to them, of all kinds of hairdos.
Hair shop, hairstylist shop, which is bourgeoisie, as we covered in the previous podcast, capitalist-based, right, making money, having a business. So that entire shop was destroyed, and the shop owners were forced to get onto their knees, and they were beaten in public. Also, all kinds of religious idols.
We were told to assemble at the Central Art Academy. Also, statues of David, all of themselves. They lit the pile and made us stand around it. It was one of the hottest days of the summer. The flames rose 100 feet. They ordered us to get down on our knees. They sang and they kicked us, forcing us closer to the flames. What did it look like? Cannibals in a song and dance ritual, about to cook their captives.
Were there any rules for wiping out the four olds? No, the kids made them up.
So they would destroy Ming Dynasty monasteries and statues and stuff. These were thousands of years old. And they would kill monks and so on and so forth. So this is a result of another, seemingly what you might call in America, innocent, inspiring movement, but it took a slightly different turn. And all these young students, they were actually turned against the intellectuals of society who were thought to have brought down the communistic ideals of Mao Zedong. Here's a quick Wikipedia read, what you can read about the Red August, which was a particular period of time in which the Red Guard were massacring people across Beijing and also other associated cities. So let's just read a little bit here. The August of 1966. So this was just 1 year before the Summer of Love. You can see these two parallel paths. Very interesting. Indicated a series of massacres in Beijing. According to the official statistics in 1980, from August to September in 1966, a total of 1,772 people, including teachers and principals of many schools, were killed in Beijing by Red Guards. In addition, 33,695 homes were ransacked, and 85,196 families were forced to leave the city. The killing by the Red Guards also made an impact on several rural districts of Beijing, causing the Daxing massacre, for example, during which 325 people were killed from August to September 1st. And then there are many such instances. Here it says the actual death toll during the Red August was over 10,000 people. And also I was reading some stuff, there were instances of even cannibalism in the countryside. The school children were having ritualistic cannibal ceremonies. Unbelievable atrocities. Why? You can look here. The Four Olds is a concept that's mentioned here. This was one of the principles mentioned in Mao Zedong's Red Book, which is a little red book, which was his kind of manifesto on Chinese communism. Now I've lost that reference. Anyway, the Four Olds, I think they were mentioned in that documentary also. The old way of life, old religion, old habits. Basically the capitalistic way of life. So actually it is the same ideal as the counterculture in America. Same ideal. out with the old, in with a new way of living. But this energy can be wrongly directed, and as a result, in China, the Cultural Revolution ended up eventually killing 2 million people in horrific ways, and also the torture of many, many more, and the destruction of the lives of many, many tens of millions. So this idea, if it doesn't have proper roots in the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, it's actually very destructive. And the people at the time of Haight-Ashbury were very fortunate, of course, to receive the mercy of Srila Prabhupada, who brought the perfection of that hippie philosophy. So, yeah, there are a couple other points I wanted to mention.
From suspicion of...
Just let me just see if I can. I have some notes here, just to guide me, because there is quite a lot of stuff here. So yeah. There's another point is that of course when people become intoxicated with the material enjoyment, and then they become fed up because they realize it's not satisfactory, renunciation is easier. So that is another reason that the movement took off in the 60s when Srila Prabhupada came. So yeah, the point of this podcast is to point out why specifically counterculture is not necessarily a good idea in and of itself. Something I noticed by watching a lot of these documentaries is that people hold it as a very high ideal, especially the people who were involved with it when it was happening. And they do like this idea that it should come back. What they don't know is how to properly execute it and what the real ultimate goal is. Ultimately, counterculture and any kind of revolutionary movement like communism or so many things is just a patchwork solution, a temporary solution for the greater problems of life, right? Ultimately, everyone is feeling dissatisfied, whether you're a capitalist or a communist or a hippie or a straight edge person, whatever. You're facing the same problems: birth, death, old age, and disease. And these things can only be solved by the ultimate counterculture movement, Krishna consciousness. If counterculture movement means a subculture, a small group of people, a particular group of people, which goes against the grains and norms of society, then the Krishna consciousness movement is the ultimate counterculture movement. The whole principle of Krishna consciousness is to go against the grain of material existence itself, to reawaken our relationship with God and become the servant of gods, pure servant of gods, of Krishna, as opposed to wanting to become Krishna yourself. Because ultimately, even if you have this idea, and Srila Prabhupada also pointed this out, that the hippies, they have renounced everything. They have renounced material enjoyment, but they still can't give up, I think it's sex life. So the sex life is still there. What is that? In its root, it's the enjoyership mentality. We're not the enjoyer. Krishna is the enjoyer. I pointed this out in the previous podcast. We pointed out in practically every single podcast. Krishna is the actual enjoyer of everything. God is the proprietor of everything, the supreme controller. And when we want to imitate God, we come to this material world, then we create so many problems for ourselves, like communism, capitalism, materialism, so many things. So the original root cause is our desire to be the enjoyer. And therefore we're now stuck in this struggle, this washing machine of material existence, this whirlpool, and we're trying to find different solutions, different patchwork solutions. Okay, now maybe taking drugs, freeing ourselves from our minds, coming up with different economic solutions, communal living. These are good in theory for some time, but they don't solve the root issue. And they can't solve those ultimate problems: birth, death, old age, and disease. Why we have to die? Because we have to have a material body. why we have to have a material body, a temporary body made of the elements of earth, water, fire, and air and ether, because that body gives us the illusion that we are the enjoyer, we are God. So the Krishna Consciousness movement goes against that whole principle. It's about purification of consciousness, and just like Jerry Garcia wanted, right? Simple living, high thinking. Krishna Consciousness also gives you that. Minimize the bodily necessities, because as I mentioned, we're not the body, and save time for spiritual realization. Don't take LSD. Don't waste time in so many different pursuits, dancing in a park for no reason, just for your own sense gratification, and having sex like cats and dogs. Utilize that time to instead chant, nicely, dance nicely for Krishna, and in this way you become spiritually liberated. Don't indulge in sex life. Get yourself married nicely. Raise a Krishna conscious family. Have Krishna conscious children. Develop them. Help them become liberated from the material world. This is a productive movement of counterculturalism. Yes, the culture is rubbish. Yes, materialistic ideals don't go anywhere, and they just, ultimately lead us to conflict, dissatisfaction, envy, and they haven't done any good for anyone. But neither has the counterculture movement, because it doesn't address that original, as I said before many times, root problem. And if you want to wear alternative clothing, if you want to be a special in the crowd, which is also one of the aims of counterculture, right? To be distinct, to go against the status quo, then what could be more countercultural than wearing a dhoti, right? Go full orange or full white or whatever, wear a traditional devotional dress, put the face markings on, tilak, shave your head, chant Hare Krishna in the streets with drums and kartals. Of course, not everyone has to do that. You can also chant Hare Krishna at home and live a more subtle life of Krishna consciousness. But if you want to join a countercultural movement, if you want this idea to come back, if you're fed up with the norms of society, then there's no better, more permanent, and more real movement than the Krishna Consciousness movement. So to answer Bhakti-Neel Prabhu's question, what is Krishna Consciousness movement? Is it a subculture, is it a counterculture, or is it something entirely new? It is both a counterculture, it is both a subculture, and it is something entirely new also. And like Narottam Das Thakura, who is one of the great teachers in our line of spiritual masters, he says that the maha-mantra, which is the mantra of deliverance for this age, as I was mentioning before, we don't take LSD, but we turn on, we tune in, and we tune into the maha-mantra. We chant in to the maha-mantra, which is a transcendental vibration. It brings one to the spiritual platform on which you can see everyone equally. Pandita Samadarshana, the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, I learn a highly elevated sage, he can see everyone equally on the spiritual platform, which is one of the ideals of the hippie movement, right? To see everyone equally, to treat equally. Not see as white or black or man or woman or rich or poor. This is possible only through spiritual consciousness, when you can actually perceive what someone is beyond the body, the spirit soul. So by chanting this Hare Krishna Maha-mantra, all the ideals of these counterculture movements are achieved, but they're also permanent assets, and they bring real happiness to the living entity. So, and now I just lost my point. So we tune in to chanting Hare Krishna, and yes, this is the actual. Okay, it's something entirely new, right? Narottam Das Thakur, right? So Narottam Das Thakur says this maha-mantra is imported directly from the spiritual world. It comes from Goloka Vrindavan, the transcendental planet where Lord Krishna himself lives. It's coming from there, and because it comes from there, it inspires transcendental ecstasy and transcendental realization. So it is also something entirely new to the Western society, at least. Of course, this movement and the process of Krishna consciousness is eternal, but to the Western society, it is something not necessarily defined in the English language. It is a totally transcendental movement, and it is a perfect movement. So if you're watching this, if you want to be a hippie, and even if you don't want to be a hippie, be a transcendental hippie, be a happy, as Srila Prabhupada says. He made hippies into happies. So chant Hare Krishna, read Srila Prabhupada's books, and go and watch the rest of the BLISS podcast if you haven't already. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time on the BLISS podcast. Hare Krishna. Also, please subscribe to the channel. That would be very nice.